The cry in the dark. The streets of Ridgeport had always been unforgiving, but tonight felt different. Officer Tom Grayson gripped the steering wheel of his patrol car, scanning the desolate streets illuminated only by flickering streetlights. The chill of early winter seeped through his uniform, the bitter wind rattling loose shutters and sending plastic bags tumbling like urban tumbleweeds. Something felt off. He had learned to trust his gut over the years. 25 years on the force, long enough to have seen the city's slow decay, long enough to recognize when the night was holding its breath. The radio crackled to life. Unit 6, we have a report of possible disturbance near Mason and 14th. Unconfirmed, but a local called in a strange noise. Could be nothing. Grayson exhaled sharply, taking a slow sip of the lukewarm coffee in his thermos. He had handled dozens of disturbances in this part of town, most turning out to be stray dogs rummaging through trash, a drunk cursing at ghosts, or the wind wailing through the alleyways. Still, that feeling. He flicked on his headlights and steered toward Mason and 14th, the street barely visible through the cracked windshield. The city's darkness seemed heavier here. Buildings slumped against each other like broken men in an alley fight, their shattered windows empty and soulless. Then he heard it. A thin, reedy cry, barely audible over the wind. Tom froze. His breath hitched. That wasn't the sound of a cat or a drunkard. It was softer, fragile, a sound that shouldn't be here. Instinct took over. He threw the car into park, grabbing his flashlight as he stepped into the alley beside the abandoned liquor store. The stench hit him first. Rotting garbage, mildew, something else. Something wrong. The cry came again, weaker this time. Grayson's pulse pounded in his ears as he scanned the dumpster lined against the wall. His flashlight swept over discarded beer bottles, torn cardboard boxes, crumpled newspapers, and then tiny feet, pale, unmoving, peeking out from beneath a torn garbage bag. For a second, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. It was as if the world had tilted and dumped him into a nightmare. Oh, Jesus. He lunged forward, throwing aside trash bags with shaking hands. 2 newborns, barely larger than his forearm, lay curled together in the filth. Their skin was ice cold. Their tiny chests rose and fell, barely breathing. One of them gave a weak whimper, so soft it was almost lost in the wind. Tom shrugged off his jacket and wrapped them up, pulling them against his chest. Their bodies were like ice, their lips tinged blue. How long had they been here? How close had they come to dying alone in the dark? His fingers trembled as he grabbed his radio. Dispatch. This is Officer Grayson. 1242 Mason Street. I need an ambulance now. I have two newborn infants, alive but severely hypothermic. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, all professionalism and urgency. Copy that. Officer. Emergency response en route. Stay on the line. But Tom barely heard her. He rocked the tiny bundles in his arms, trying to share what little warmth he could. The weight of them, so light, so fragile, sent a deep ache through his chest. Hold on, little ones, he whispered. You're safe now, I promise. The wind howled through the alleyway as Officer Tom Grayson clutched the 2 newborns against his chest, his breath clouding in the frigid air. The ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, but it felt like they were moving too damn slow. Every second stretched into eternity. Were the babies even breathing? He pressed his ear close, feeling the shallow rise and fall of their tiny chests. Too weak. Too damn weak. Stay with me, little ones, he murmured, his voice hoarse. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs. They had to make it. He had seen too many bodies left to die in Ridgeport's alleys. He wouldn't let these babies become another forgotten statistic. One of the twins gave a faint, gasping cry, barely a whimper. The other one didn't make a sound. Shit. Tom dropped to one knee, sheltering the babies with his body against the wind. He cradled the silent one. A tiny girl, her delicate face impossibly pale, and pressed 2 fingers against her chest. Her breathing was barely there, but it was there. "Come on, baby girl. Keep fighting." Finally, red and blue lights flickered off the brick walls of the alley as the ambulance screeched to a stop. 2 paramedics, Riley and Mendoza, jumped out, moving with calm urgency. "What do we got, Grayson?" Riley asked, already pulling out a thermal blanket. "Newborns. Dumpster. Hypothermic. This one's barely breathing," Tom said, his voice sharp with urgency as he handed over the weaker twin. Mendoza carefully took the other, her face tightening with concern as she checked the baby's vital signs. "Jesus," she muttered. "Who the hell leaves newborns in the trash? Someone who doesn't deserve to breathe the same air as them." Tom swallowed down the burning anger in his chest. It wasn't about revenge. Not now. Right now, these babies needed to live. Riley worked quickly, wrapping the weaker twin in an insulated blanket and placing an oxygen mask over her tiny face. "Heart rate slow, but she's hanging on," he said, glancing at Mendoza. "We need to get them to the hospital now." Tom nodded. "I'm coming with you." Riley didn't argue. He had seen that look in Tom's eyes before, the same one he'd worn after pulling a drowning kid from the river last winter. Pure, unwavering determination. Together, they climbed into the ambulance. The doors slammed shut, and the sirens screamed through the night as they raced toward Ridgeport General Hospital. The fight for life. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked fast, their hands steady despite the urgency. Tom couldn't take his eyes off the twins. They were so damn small, so breakable. Every now and then, the monitors beeped irregularly, each off-rhythm tone sending a fresh wave of fear through him. Mendoza adjusted the oxygen flow, shaking her head. "The girl's temp is still dropping." Tom clenched his fists. "No, not today. Not on my watch." "Come on, little one," he murmured. He had seen too much death in his career, too many lives lost in alleys, gutters, and forgotten corners of the city. Not them. Not these babies. Riley glanced up, noticing the way Tom was gripping the side of the stretcher. "You okay, Grayson?" Tom exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. "Yeah," he lied. "Just makes you wonder what kind of monster does this." Riley shook his head. "More than one kind." Neither of them said the obvious truth. Monsters walk these streets every damn day. As the ambulance swayed over potholes, the smaller twin made a soft, shuddering sound. Mendoza looked down and froze. She stopped breathing. Everything stopped. "Shit, she's coding," Riley shouted, already moving. The heart monitor screamed. The tiny girl was still. Too still. Mendoza started infant CPR, her movements precise but desperate. "Come on, baby. Breathe for me." Tom's stomach turned to ice. He had seen plenty of bodies go cold before, but never this small. Never this innocent. The ambulance lurched as Riley grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, we have a code blue. Infant in respiratory arrest. ETA 2 minutes. Get NICU prepped." Tom gripped the side of the stretcher, his knuckles white. "Come back. Come back, damn it." Mendoza continued compressions, her fingers so small compared to the baby's fragile chest. 1, 2, 3. Breathe. Nothing. Then, a tiny gasp. The monitor beeped weakly. The little girl sucked in a thin breath. "That's it," Mendoza whispered, relief breaking through her concentration. "That's it, sweetheart. Keep fighting." Tom finally allowed himself to breathe. The ambulance swerved into the emergency bay, the doors flying open as doctors and nurses rushed forward. Tom jumped out as the paramedics carefully transferred the twins into waiting hands. Status. Dr. Evelyn Carter, the lead neonatologist, barked as she jogged beside the gurney. "Severe hypothermia. Unknown exposure time. The smaller twin just coded but resuscitated en route," Mendoza reported quickly. Dr. Carter nodded sharply, already assessing the babies as they were wheeled through the hospital doors. NICU, stat. Let's get warming blankets and continuous monitoring. Tom followed, his boots echoing against the tile floor. His pulse still thundered in his ears. It wasn't over. Not yet. A promise in the dark. Hours passed. Tom sat in the waiting area outside the NICU, watching the clock, his foot tapping against the floor. 3:17 a.m. He hadn't moved since they took the babies in. He couldn't. Every now and then, he glanced up at the hallway leading to the neonatal unit, expecting a doctor to walk out with bad news. He had seen too many bad endings before. But he wasn't walking away. Not tonight. A soft voice startled him. Officer Grayson. He looked up. Dr. Carter stood before him, her face tired but not grim. Tom stood too fast, his knees protesting. Are they? They're alive, she said, her voice gentle. Still in critical condition, but stable. They're fighters. Tom exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just a fraction. Do they have any family? He asked. Dr. Carter hesitated. We don't know. There was no identification, no birth records matching their description. Tom's jaw clenched. Someone dumped them like trash. Her eyes darkened. Yes, and whoever did it didn't want them to be found. The weight of her words settled deep in his gut. Dr. Carter sighed, glancing toward the NICU window. CPS will take over from here. They'll decide placement once the twins are healthy enough to leave. Tom's stomach turned. CPS, the system. He had seen too many kids vanish into it, lost in the cracks, shuffled between foster homes, forgotten until something bad happened. He looked past her, through the glass window. The two newborns lay in tiny incubators, their fragile bodies wrapped in warming blankets, so small, so helpless. He had found them. He had saved them. And yet, in a few days, they'd be gone. Just files on a desk, names on a report. Forgotten. Tom clenched his fists. Not these two. Not this time. He stepped forward, his voice low, but certain. I want to know where they end up. Dr. Carter studied him for a moment before nodding. I'll see what I can do. As he stared at the tiny babies behind the glass, he made a promise. You made it this far. I won't let you disappear. Into the system. 1 week later, the vanishing. The rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors filled the quiet room in the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU. The twin girls lay inside separate incubators, wrapped in tiny, pale blue blankets, their fragile chests rising and falling beneath a tangle of tubes and monitoring wires. They were getting stronger, but not fast enough. Officer Tom Grayson sat outside the NICU, his weathered hands clasped together as he stared through the glass window. The past week had been a blur of sleepless nights, hospital visits, and an unshakable sense of dread in his chest. They should be safe now. That was what everyone kept telling him. But Tom had been a cop too long to believe in safety. Not in this city. A nurse walked past, giving him a sympathetic smile. He nodded back, but his mind was elsewhere. What if no one claims them? He had asked the doctor days ago. Then they go into the system, she had said. And if the system fails? Her hesitation was all the answer he needed. The system always failed. And something in his gut told him, these twins were going to disappear. It's out of your hands, officer. 2 days later, Tom strode into Ridgeport Child Protective Services, CPS, his boots heavy against the tile floor. The waiting area was crowded. Too many lost kids. Too few caseworkers. An exhausted mother sat with her arms crossed, rocking a crying toddler. A teenage boy hunched over in a chair, staring blankly at the floor, his face bruised and swollen. Tom had been here before, too many times. But this time was different. He approached the front desk, flashing his retired badge. I need to speak with someone about the twins brought in from Ridgeport General, December 22nd. No names, newborns. The receptionist, A tired-looking woman in her 40s frowned at her computer screen. Her fingers clacked over the keys, then stilled. "I'm sorry, officer. There's no record of twins being brought into the system that night." Tom froze. "No record?" His chest tightened. "That's impossible. I was there. I found them." The receptionist shrugged. "Maybe there was a mix-up at the hospital." Tom clenched his jaw. "No, this wasn't a mix-up. I want to speak to their caseworker. Now." She hesitated, then sighed. "One moment." A few minutes later, Anna Whitmore, a CPS senior caseworker, walked out of the back offices. She was all business, a sharp gray blazer, glasses perched at the edge of her nose, and a stack of files under one arm. "Officer Grayson," she said smoothly, extending a hand. "I understand you're inquiring about the twin girls." "Yes," Tom said, shaking her hand firmly. "Where are they?" She sighed, flipping through her manila folder. The hospital transferred custody of the infants to the state, and from there, they were placed with a temporary guardian. Tom's stomach dropped. "Who?" She shook her head. "That information is confidential. I understand you feel connected to them, but don't give me that. I want to know where they are," he snapped, his frustration spilling over. Anna's professional mask didn't waver. "Officer, I appreciate your concern, but this is no longer your case. I assure you, CPS followed all the proper procedures." Something about the way she said it, too polished, too careful, sent a chill up his spine. "Then why is there no record of them?" he asked. Anna hesitated, just a flicker. But Tom caught it. "Look, I'll check into it," she said finally, her voice cool and dismissive. "But I suggest you let this go." Tom leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near growl. "I don't let things go." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Then I hope you know what you're getting yourself into, officer." She turned and walked away. Tom stood there, fists clenched. That wasn't a warning. That was a threat. And something was very, very wrong. The case file that didn't exist. By the time Tom got back to his apartment that night, he had one goal: find those twins before it was too late. He threw his coat over the chair and sat at his old desk, flipping open his laptop. The system was flawed, sure. But babies didn't just vanish. There were always records, except when someone erased them. His first stop, the hospital database. His old connections still gave him access to restricted police reports. He typed in the details. December 22nd, Ridgeport General. 2 newborns found in an alley. Nothing. His fingers moved faster. He searched through welfare reports, emergency call logs, hospital transfers. Still nothing. Every mention of the twins, gone. It was like they had never existed. Tom's pulse thundered. Someone had made them disappear. The name that shouldn't have been there. Digging deeper, Tom finally found something. Buried in an old hospital invoice, there was a name connected to a discharged patient. A single signature stood out at the bottom of the page. Calvin Briggs. Tom's heart stopped. No. He read it again. Calvin Briggs. A name he hadn't seen in over a decade. A name that should have never been near these twins. Because Calvin Briggs wasn't just another caseworker. He was a ghost from Tom's past. A child trafficker. A predator who had slipped through the cracks too many times, always one step ahead of the law. And now, somehow, he had touched this case. Tom's hand shook as he closed the laptop. The babies weren't just missing. They had been taken. And if Calvin Briggs had them, they were running out of time. A race against time. 2 weeks later, the silence that meant everything. The rain hammered against Tom Grayson's windshield as he parked across the street from an old brick townhouse on the edge of Ridgeport. The address was buried in a hospital invoice, one of the only clues he had about where the twins had been taken. The past 2 weeks had been hell. He had called every contact he had left in law enforcement, dug through old records, even tracked down CPS employees at their homes. But nothing. No paperwork. No legal transfers. No evidence the twins had ever even entered the system. They had vanished. And now, he had one name. Calvin Briggs. The man was a ghost, but not to Tom. He had been hunting Briggs for years. A foster father. A child services liaison. A man who had connections in all the right places. He had been accused of trafficking kids before, but the cases never stuck. The witnesses disappeared, the records got lost, and the investigators got reassigned. But Tom knew the truth. Briggs was a monster. And now he had the twins. Tom took a slow breath, watching the townhouse. No lights inside. No movement. He checked his sidearm, tucking it into the holster beneath his jacket. He wasn't on the force anymore, but some habits never died. Then he stepped out into the cold night, breaking into the past. The townhouse looked abandoned, but Tom knew better. Briggs wasn't the kind of man to leave evidence lying around. If this was his last known address, there was something inside worth hiding. Tom approached the front door carefully, pressing a gloved hand against the worn wood. Locked. Of course. He stepped back, his eyes scanning the perimeter. A side entrance. A narrow alley ran beside the house, leading to a rusted metal fire escape. Bingo. He climbed. His boots made barely a sound as he hoisted himself onto the rickety platform. Second floor window. The latch was weak. A quick shove, and he was inside. The moment his feet hit the floor, he knew something was wrong. The air was stale. The room was too clean, like someone had wiped it down, erased everything, but not well enough. Tom moved quickly, checking drawers, searching for anything Briggs had left behind. Then he found it. A folder, stuffed into the back of a locked cabinet, hidden beneath old case files from CPS. Tom pulled it out, flipping through the papers. His pulse spiked. Photos. Dozens of them. The twins. Taken inside a hospital, outside a foster center. And then, somewhere else. His breath hitched. The last few photos were recent. One of the twins, the smaller one, the weaker one, was strapped into a car seat, her face pale and confused. In the background, Tom recognized a warehouse. A very specific one. He had seen that building before, and he knew exactly where it was. The warehouse of missing children. Ridgeport's industrial district was a graveyard of forgotten places. Factories left to rot, warehouses filled with rusted machinery and old memories. But this one was different. This one was alive. Tom parked half a block away, his eyes locked on the gray steel building with the faded S and J Store AG sign barely visible above the loading dock. A black SUV was parked outside. The same black SUV he had seen outside CPS 2 weeks ago. Briggs was here. Tom slipped out of his car, his breath fogging in the cold air. He moved fast, sticking close to the shadows. His old cop instincts kicked in, watching for cameras, listening for movement. Then, a sound. A cry. Faint. Weak. Coming from inside. Tom's chest tightened. They were in there. The monster in the dark. He moved toward a side entrance, pressing his ear against the metal door. Muffled voices. Then, the door suddenly creaked open from the inside. Tom lunged back into the shadows, pressing against the cold steel of a nearby dumpster. A figure stepped out. Tall, wearing a black coat. Briggs. The man lit a cigarette, exhaling slow as he checked the street. His posture was relaxed, confident, like someone who knew he was untouchable. Tom's fists clenched. For years, this bastard had been walking free, moving through the system, using it like his personal hunting ground. Not tonight. Briggs flicked his cigarette onto the pavement and stepped back inside. Tom waited 10 seconds, then moved. Inside the devil's lair. The warehouse smelled of oil, mildew, and something worse. He followed the voices, sticking close to the walls. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. A single bare light bulb illuminated the back room. And there, in the middle of the room, was a crib. A baby. One of the twins. Tom barely registered the two men standing nearby, because all he could see was the tiny girl strapped into the crib, her arms twitching weakly. The rage hit him like a train. Then, a voice. "I was wondering when you'd show up, Grayson." Tom's blood turned to ice. "Briggs." The man stepped forward, his smirk cold, his eyes filled with amusement. "Still playing hero," Briggs said smoothly. "I thought you were tired." Tom's hand drifted toward his gun. "Where's the other twin?" Tom growled. Briggs laughed softly, shaking his head. "Oh, Tom, you should have walked away." He nodded toward the other man standing in the shadows. Tom's instincts screamed, but it was too late. A fist slammed into his ribs. The world tilted. He hit the ground, his gun skidding across the floor. Then the darkness swallowed him. Nowhere left to run. Darkness, then pain. Tom Grayson woke up to pain. It came in sharp waves, throbbing in his ribs, an ache in his head, and the unmistakable burn in his wrists where zip ties bit into his skin. His head pounded as he blinked, the dim light above him swimming in and out of focus. His mouth was dry. His shoulders were pulled back unnaturally, bound behind the metal chair he was strapped to. The warehouse. Memories came rushing back. The baby in the crib. Briggs. Then, the ambush. A door creaked open somewhere behind him, followed by the slow, measured sound of footsteps approaching. Briggs. Tom didn't have to see the man's face to know who it was. He knew that calm, collected rhythm. The unbothered arrogance. "You're awake," Briggs said smoothly, his voice calm, almost amused. "Took you long enough." Tom gritted his teeth. "Where's the other twin?" His voice came out rough, but steady. Briggs chuckled, stepping into view. Even in the dim light, he was sharp, immaculate suit, hair slicked back, a smug look on his face like he had already won. "Still worried about them, huh?" Briggs mused, leaning against a nearby table. "You always were sentimental, Grayson. It's why you could never finish the job." Tom ignored the bait. He couldn't afford to get rattled. "The babies," he repeated, jaw tight. "Where are they?" Briggs exhaled, as if disappointed. "You're missing the bigger picture, old man. The real question isn't where they are." His smirk deepened. "It's why they were taken in the first place." Tom's stomach twisted. "You were a good cop, Grayson," Briggs continued, walking in slow circles around him. "Too good. Always sticking your nose where it didn't belong. Always thinking you could save people." He stopped directly behind Tom. A hand gripped Tom's shoulder, firm and unshakable. "But you never asked the real question. Why do some kids disappear, while others don't?" The weight of those words settled deep in Tom's chest. He had spent decades on the force, chasing missing children, trying to bring them home. Some were found. Most weren't. But the system, it was broken. And Briggs knew exactly how to use it. Tom clenched his fists, rage coiling in his gut. "You always had someone on the inside." Briggs patted his shoulder, mockingly. "I had everyone on the inside, Tom. Social workers, hospital admins, even a few cops. The twins? They were never supposed to make it into the system, asterisk, asterisk. They were supposed to disappear, asterisk, asterisk." The confession made Tom's skin crawl. He knew CPS was corrupt, but this wasn't just neglect. This was organized. Deliberate. Tom lifted his head, locking eyes with Briggs. "You're running out of time." Briggs raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" Tom let a slow smirk creep onto his own face, despite the pain slicing through his ribs. "You screwed up, Briggs," he said. "You took something you shouldn't have. And now, you're sloppy. You left tracks." Briggs' face didn't move, but Tom saw it. The flicker of something behind his eyes. A hesitation. Tom knew he had hit a nerve. He pressed forward. "You think you own this city, That you can just erase people. Well, guess what? You didn't erase me. And you sure as hell didn't erase the truth. Briggs' smile faltered. Barely. Then, with terrifying calmness, he turned to the man standing in the shadows near the back of the room. Break his fingers. Tom barely had time to react before a fist crashed into his face. Pain exploded behind his eyes. Then, darkness. The last twin. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried. Tom's head snapped up, pain slicing through him like a hot knife. He was still tied to the chair. His face throbbed, and his fingers were numb from blood loss. His right hand was bent at a sickening angle. At least 2 fingers were broken. But the cry, it was close. He turned his head, blinking past the pain. There, in the far corner of the warehouse, was the second twin. She was smaller than he remembered, wrapped in a thin blanket, placed in a bassinet shoved against the wall like a piece of discarded furniture. Tom's chest clenched. She was alive. He had been right. Briggs was keeping them here. But why? A shadow moved near the bassinet. Tom's breath stalled. A woman stepped forward. She wasn't a stranger. Anna Whitmore. The same CPS worker who had told him the twins weren't in the system. The same woman who had looked him in the eyes and lied. Anna, Tom whispered. His voice was hoarse, his throat raw from the beating. You're working with him. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You don't understand, Tom, she murmured. Tom's heart pounded. Make me understand. She hesitated, just a second, long enough for Tom to see it. The guilt. Not all of them survive in foster care, she said softly. You know that. They get tossed around, forgotten, abused. But with Briggs, at least they're given to people who want them. Tom's stomach turned. You mean the highest bidder? Anna flinched. It's better than being abandoned. Or worse. Tom shook his head, his rage searing through the fog of pain. You tell yourself that so you can sleep at night, he spat. But you're selling children. You're just as bad as him. Anna's jaw clenched. But before she could respond, the warehouse door slammed open. Gunfire erupted. The reckoning. Chaos exploded around them. A barrage of bullets tore through the air, shattering crates, sending dust and debris flying. Tom threw himself sideways, toppling the chair he was tied to just as gunfire ripped through the space where his head had been. FBI. Drop your weapons. A new voice, shouting orders, commanding authority. Tom rolled onto his side, gritting his teeth against the pain. His ears rang from the gunfire, but he forced himself to focus. The warehouse was flooded with tactical agents. Someone had tipped them off. Tom struggled against the zip ties. His wrists burned, but he yanked harder, his fingers slick with sweat and blood. Then, a gun clicked near his ear. Briggs. The man had survived the initial assault. He was bleeding from a wound on his shoulder, his expensive suit torn, but his gun was still steady. You should have just let it go, Tom, he murmured, voice dark. Tom smirked. I told you, Briggs, he growled. You screwed up. Briggs hesitated. Just long enough for a single gunshot to crack through the air. Briggs stumbled. A look of pure shock flashed across his face. Then he collapsed. Anna stood behind him, her hand trembling around a smoking gun. Her face was pale, her eyes unreadable. The FBI agents stormed forward, securing the scene. Tom barely noticed. He was already crawling toward the tiny bassinet in the corner. He reached inside, hands shaking, and pulled the baby against his chest. She whimpered, but she was warm. She was alive. Tom closed his eyes, relief crashing over him. It was over. At least for now. The aftermath. The baby's warm body trembled in Tom's arms, but her heartbeat was steady. She was alive. The FBI agents swept the warehouse, securing the remaining suspects. Agents pulled Briggs' bleeding body away, while others took Anna into custody. Tom barely noticed. His world had narrowed down to the tiny life in his hands. A female agent approached, lowering her weapon. Her dark eyes scanned Tom carefully. "Officer Grayson." Tom finally looked up. His breath was ragged, his ribs on fire, but he nodded. "Yeah." She holstered her weapon. "I'm Special Agent Lisa Carter, FBI Child Exploitation Task Force." She gestured toward the baby. "Is she okay?" Tom swallowed, his throat thick with emotion. "Yeah, she's okay." Agent Carter exhaled in relief. "We'll have medics check her out. But first, we need to talk." The house of cards comes crashing down. 20 minutes later, Tom sat in the back of an unmarked FBI SUV, still holding the baby. The second twin was found in another location, alive but weak. Tom's hands shook as he passed the infant to a paramedic, who quickly wrapped her in a warm blanket. Agent Carter climbed into the passenger seat, her expression unreadable. "You have no idea what you just stumbled into," she said finally. Tom clenched his jaw. "Then tell me." She glanced out the window, watching as agents swarmed the warehouse. "Briggs was just a piece of this. We've been tracking him for years, but every time we got close, our evidence vanished. Witnesses disappeared, records erased." Tom nodded. "Same here. I tried for years to pin him down. He always slipped through the cracks." Carter's fingers tapped against the dashboard. "Because he had help. People in the system. High up." Tom's stomach twisted. "Anna Whitmore," he muttered. Carter nodded. "And she's just one of many. This isn't just about CPS failing these kids. It was never meant to work in the first place. They built it broken, so children could be funneled into the hands of people like Briggs." Tom's anger burned cold. For decades, he had seen kids vanish, seen families destroyed by a system that was supposed to protect them. But now he finally knew why. "Who else is involved?" Tom asked, his voice low. Carter hesitated, then handed him a file. Tom flipped it open and froze. The first page held a familiar name. Deputy Commissioner Alan Rourke. Tom's chest tightened. He had worked cases for Rourke back when he was still on the force. The man had been his superior, a mentor. "You're telling me Rourke was part of this?" Tom whispered, disbelieving. Carter's expression darkened. Rourke wasn't just involved. He was running it. Tom felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. This wasn't just some small trafficking operation. It was bigger, deeper. And the people behind it. They weren't done yet. Loose ends are dangerous. 2 hours later, Tom sat in an FBI safe house, his body aching, his ribs screaming in pain. He was patched up, bruised, and exhausted, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. The twins were safe, for now. Carter assured him they were under FBI protection. But Rourke, he was still out there. And something told Tom that Briggs was never the real threat. A burner phone buzzed on the table beside him. Tom frowned. Only Carter had this number. He answered, "Yeah." A deep, familiar voice crackled through the speaker. "You should have walked away, Tom." Tom's entire body went rigid. "Alan Rourke. I should have known you'd be too stubborn to let this go." Rourke sighed. His tone was calm, almost amused. "You always were a pain in the ass." Tom's grip on the phone tightened. "You son of a..." Rourke chuckled. "Easy, old friend. No need to get emotional. I just called to give you one last chance." Tom's blood ran cold. "Walk away," Rourke continued. "Go back to your quiet retirement. Live out the rest of your days in peace." Tom's jaw clenched. "And if I don't?" The line was silent for a moment. Then Rourke said, "Then you won't live long enough to regret it." Click. The call ended. Tom stared at the phone, his heart pounding. This wasn't over. Not even close. The hunter becomes the hunted. 2 days later, the warning. Tom Grayson had survived ambushes, shootouts, and 25 years of chasing ghosts. But nothing chilled him to his core quite like that phone call from Alan Rourke. Then you won't live long enough to regret it. A warning, a promise, a death sentence. He should have expected it. No one could expose a corrupt high-ranking law enforcement officer like Rourke and expect to walk away untouched. But Tom wasn't walking away. The fire that shouldn't have happened. The first attack came at 2:47 a.m. Tom had been at a motel on the outskirts of Ridgeport, lying awake in the darkness. His ribs still ached from Briggs' beating, but it was the silence that bothered him more. It was too quiet. Then, the smell of smoke. Tom's entire body locked up. The hallway alarm started blaring, followed by the sharp, acrid scent of burning wood and melting plastic. A fire. And it wasn't an accident. Tom grabbed his bag, stuffing his gun and the file on Rourke inside. He threw open the motel door and immediately felt the heat. The flames had already engulfed the far end of the hallway. Smoke choked the air, curling toward the ceiling in thick black waves. The fire exit was blocked. Tom's mind raced. He couldn't afford to die here. Not before he stopped Rourke. Not before he saved the twins. He spotted a bathroom window, barely large enough to squeeze through. He grabbed a towel, soaked it in the sink, and wrapped it around his mouth before charging forward. The heat licked at his skin, but he kept moving. One shot. One chance. Tom threw himself against the window, smashing through the glass just as the fire exploded behind him. He hit the pavement hard, rolling to absorb the impact. The heat was still searing his back, the air thick with smoke, but he was alive. Tom pushed himself up, stumbling away from the burning building. A black SUV was parked across the street. Its engine idled, watching, waiting. Then it drove away. Tom clenched his fists. Rourke wasn't just sending a warning. He was hunting him. A new player enters the game. By sunrise, Tom had relocated to an old mechanic's garage, a safe house known only to a few former cops. His contact, Luis Ortega, a retired homicide detective, stood beside him, arms crossed. "This is bad, man," Ortega muttered, flipping through the file Tom had stolen from Briggs' warehouse. "Rourke isn't just some corrupt cop. He's the damn puppet master. If he wants you gone, he won't stop until you're in the ground." Tom sighed. "Yeah, I figured that part out when my motel room turned into a damn bonfire." Ortega gave him a serious look. "Then why the hell are you still here?" "Because I know something Rourke doesn't," Tom said, pulling out a USB drive from his pocket. Ortega raised an eyebrow. "What's on it?" Tom exhaled slowly. Proof. He had found it hidden inside Briggs' warehouse. A drive filled with bank records, adoption papers, case files, documents linking Rourke directly to the underground child trafficking network. Ortega whistled low. "Jesus, this is enough to bury him." Tom shook his head. "It's enough to make him kill anyone who gets in his way." Ortega was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "So what's the plan?" Tom's expression hardened. "We take him down. The trap is set." Tom knew Rourke would come for him. He just needed to make sure it was on his terms. He sent an email, a carefully worded message using an untraceable burner account. It was short. "I have the files. I have the proof. You want to stop me? Come find me." Then he included an address. Not a safe house, not a police station. An abandoned steel mill on the outskirts of the city, a place where no one would hear the gunfire. Tom wasn't planning on talking. He was planning on finishing this. The showdown. Tom stood inside the steel mill, his gun loaded, ready. A single overhead light flickered, casting long shadows against the rusted metal walls. Then, the sound of tires on gravel. They were here. Tom steeled himself, gripping the pistol tight. Footsteps echoed. Then, a voice he knew too well. Grayson. Alan Rourke stepped forward, flanked by two armed men. He looked calm, amused, like a man who thought he had already won. You really should have taken my offer, Rourke said, shaking his head. Tom lifted his gun. Funny. I was thinking the same thing. Rourke smirked. You gonna shoot me, Tom? That's not like you. Tom's jaw tightened. You stopped being a cop a long time ago, Rourke. Rourke tilted his head. You think you're gonna be a hero? Take me down and what? Everything gets better. He chuckled. You're a fool. The system doesn't change. You take me out, someone worse takes my place. Tom's finger hovered over the trigger. Maybe, he said, but you won't be around to see it. Gunfire erupted. Tom dove behind a metal crate, bullets tearing through the walls around him. He returned fire, hitting one of Rourke's men in the leg. The guy went down screaming. Rourke ducked behind a rusted support beam, shouting orders. Tom could hear sirens in the distance. Back up. Ortega had tipped off the FBI. Rourke must have realized it too, because suddenly, he was running. Tom gave chase, weaving through the steel mill as bullets cracked against the metal walls. Then, he saw him. Rourke was making for an exit. Tom raised his gun. Rourke turned. Tom fired. The bullet hit Rourke in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. His gun clattered to the ground. Tom closed the distance, kicking the weapon out of reach. Rourke clutched his bleeding arm, glaring up at him. You really think this changes anything? He hissed. Tom stepped closer, his gun aimed directly at Rourke's head. I don't care, he said coldly. But you'll never hurt another kid again. The FBI stormed in. Drop the weapon. Agents shouted, guns raised. Tom didn't move for a long moment. Then, he lowered his gun. The nightmare was finally over. Rourke was finished. And the twins. They were finally safe. The final goodbye. 3 weeks later, the weight of silence. Tom Grayson sat on a worn-out park bench, his hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee. Autumn leaves crunched beneath his boots, their burnt orange and deep red hues spreading across the pavement like a forgotten painting. The world had kept moving, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't nearly burned alive in a motel room. As if he hadn't fought for his life in a steel mill. As if 2 innocent babies hadn't been stolen, almost lost forever. Tom exhaled slowly, watching the steam rise from his coffee. Rourke was gone. Briggs was rotting in prison. The corrupt network that had thrived in the shadows for decades had been shattered. The FBI had raided offices, homes, even entire CPS branches. They'd found evidence in places no one had ever thought to look. But Tom knew the truth. The system was still broken. And monsters like them would always crawl back through the cracks. He just hoped, for once, that the twins would never have to know that world. A soft voice cut through his thoughts. Officer Grayson. Tom looked up. Danielle. She stood a few feet away, hands stuffed into her jacket pockets. Her dark eyes searched his face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Tom nodded. Yeah. She stepped forward, her movements hesitant. They told me. They told me you found us. Tom's throat tightened. You called me, he murmured. You brought me back to the case. Danielle swallowed hard, glancing away. I almost gave up looking. She gave a small, bitter laugh. I thought I was crazy. Chasing ghosts. Tom shook his head. No, you were right. Danielle hesitated, then reached into her bag, pulling out a folded photograph. She handed it to him. Tom took it carefully. It was a picture of the twins, dressed in warm clothes, wrapped in soft blankets, their tiny hands curled together. Alive. Safe. They're with a family now, Danielle said softly. Not a foster home. Not a state facility. A real family. The FBI made sure of it. Tom stared at the picture, his chest tightening. For months, he had chased shadows, fought ghosts, walked into darkness with no guarantee he would ever walk out again. And now there was light. They're gonna be okay, Danielle said, watching him carefully. Because of you. Tom exhaled slowly. He traced a finger over the edge of the photo. Then he handed it back. "You're their family," he said quietly. "Not me." Danielle's eyes shined with unshed tears. "I don't even know how to thank you." Tom gave her a small, tired smile. "Just take care of them." She nodded, swallowing hard. "I will." Then, after a long moment, she walked away. Tom watched until she was gone. Then he turned his gaze back to the city. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a man chasing ghosts. 1 month later, the final choice. The old police station hadn't changed much since Tom had left it. Same cracked tiles, same stale coffee smell, same endless stacks of paperwork clogging the desks. Chief Mark Holloway leaned back in his chair, studying Tom carefully. "You really want to do this?" Tom exhaled, nodding. "Yeah." Holloway tapped his fingers on the desk. "It won't be like before. You're not a street cop anymore, Tom. The city's changed. Hell, the whole damn world's changed." Tom smirked. "I can keep up." The chief sighed. "And why now? You walked away from this life once." Tom's gaze drifted toward the bulletin board behind the chief's desk. Missing persons reports, dozens of them. Faces of children. Some already forgotten. Some still waiting to be found. His jaw tightened. "There's always another case," he murmured. Holloway was silent for a long moment. Then, he slid a badge across the desk. It gleamed under the office light. The same shield Tom had turned in years ago. Now, it was waiting for him to pick it back up. "You're on desk duty for the first few months," Holloway said gruffly. "Don't push it. Your ribs are still healing." Tom reached out, wrapping his fingers around the badge. "Fair enough," he said. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was where he belonged. Not chasing ghosts. Not waiting for the past to catch up with him. This time, he was chasing something real. And he wasn't stopping. Epilogue. The unfinished business. The wind rattled the window of Tom's small apartment. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at an unmarked file. It had arrived an hour ago. No return address. No note. Just a thick envelope with his name on it. Tom exhaled, flipping open the file. And his blood ran cold. Inside were names. Not just Briggs. Not just Rourke. Others. Judges. Lawyers. Businessmen. People still out there. Still preying on the system. Still hiding in the dark. Tom clenched his jaw. This wasn't over. Not yet. He reached for his phone, dialing a familiar number. It rang twice before Ortega answered. "You seeing this?" Ortega asked, his voice grim. "Yeah," Tom muttered. "I'm seeing it." Silence. Then Ortega sighed. "Guess retirement's off the table." Tom smirked. "Guess so." He closed the file. Then he reached for his badge. And this time, he wasn't letting go.